So she had gone. They'd seen her off at the train station, her two bags like orphans on the crowded platform. Her father, of course, hadn't come, and her mother left the station long before the train did. But Jink and Bigger made so much commotion that bystanders thought there were 20 people seeing her off. She hugged them all goodbye, including Reef. She didn't kiss him, and he was grateful for that. He was even happier to get her second letter, the one telling about the guy she'd met in her financial accounting class. If anyone deserved a new life, a decent life, it was Scar. He traced his finger slowly over her signature, lingering over the second syllable she'd finally chosen to use. It was weird to think of her in Ontario, but he'd already gotten used to not seeing her much after starting at his new school in September. The same was true of Jink and Bigger. They'd called a few times, and he got together with them once in a while, but he was busy trying to keep his marks up and fulfilling the other conditions of his probation, like extracurriculars. Judge Thomas was wrong about one thing. He was lousy at track and field. But he surprised himself by turning out to be a better than average soccer player and, more recently, an excellent volleyball player. He led the volleyball team in points all season, and he'd even scored the tie-breaking and match points that had earned the Bonavista Bravehearts the provincial title the previous weekend. The team's picture appeared in the newspaper, and the guys at North Hills made a big deal about it, buying a dozen copies of the paper and putting the picture up everywhere. Reef was pleased, but for another reason too. He hoped that Lisa would see the photo and maybe call to congratulate him, but of course he was just kidding himself. His ability to kick and volley a ball with almost unerring accuracy confounded both his coaches, who found it difficult to believe he hadn't played either of their sports before. Although he didn't share it with them, Reef attributed his success to the considerable target practice he'd got throwing rocks over the years. Yes, the mechanics of kicking and volleying were different than those involved in throwing, but an instinct for distance and direction was crucial in both sports, and rock throwing too. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the object he'd carried with him to each of his presentations. He'd found it the day before school started, when Bigger had borrowed his brother's car and driven all four of them out to Crystal Crescent Beach to celebrate the last day of summer vacation. It hadn't turned out to be much of a celebration, though. Jink's injuries were still healing, and all that walking over rocks and sand had turned out to be an ordeal for him. To make matters worse, Bigger had decided it would be fun to harass nude sunbathers, and before Reef and Scar could stop him, he'd grabbed some clothes and strewn them all along the beach, only to discover that the clothing belonged to a young swimsuit-wearing family who were playing in the surf. It was a windy day, and it had taken the four friends nearly an hour to recover everything. While retrieving a lost sandal, Reef had spied something near the water's edge and thought for a moment that he was seeing a single black eye. The stone was almost perfectly round, its edges polished smooth by waves and wind, and it fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. He hefted it, saw in his mind's eye the smooth arc it would make when he launched it out over the waves, and then slipped it into his pocket. The Park Street overpass was still visible in the mirror as he curled his fingers around the stone. That afternoon at Crystal Crescent Beach on the last day of summer, he hadn't known why he'd chosen to keep it. He still didn't know. All that mattered now was that he had. It was the first stone he'd found since his grandmother had died that he hadn't flung as far as he could, had wanted to, hadn't needed to. He held it tight in his hand as he watched the road unfurl toward home.